Hey team, Louise Aliafouri here with Diversified Consulting. We've been getting a lot of requests lately for some pretty specific information. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take some of our most popular workshops and break those down into some bite-sized segments. And we're going to call those 20-minute PDs. Here's your first one today. We're going to explore the refugee resettlement process. We'll look at things like policy and protocol, and we'll center our newcomer students in this process. We'll also break down some of that terminology. Of course, we know that when we use the vocabulary of resettlement and immigration interchangeably, it can be problematic. So we're going to develop a little bit deeper understanding about what the terminology around the refugee resettlement experience looks like. I'm excited. Thanks for being here. Let's get in. As we move through the session, I want us to keep in mind that although we're using some of the terminology associated with status, this isn't a workshop about status. It's a workshop about lived human experience. And keeping that in mind is really critical. Because, of course, when we're focusing on status, we're rooting ourselves in assumption. When we're talking about a human's lived experience, we're centering that individual as a competent and empowered architect of their own story. Someone that's coming with enormous funds of knowledge, that's coming with talents and expertise and education and lived experience, and that can ultimately be a benefit to our communities here as well. So when we look at clarifying this language, here's what I'm talking about, right? And I do want to make a disclaimer here that although we're talking about specific status definitions, we're going to keep a very open mind here because we understand that every person's experience is unique and things may not follow the definition precisely. For example, we see that an immigrant, by definition, is one who moves to a country by choice, usually in search of better life opportunities, is often reasonably prepared for the transition. There's generally an element of choice in the destination. They may be coming for school or for work. So this example here is saying that, yes, this is the definition, but that doesn't mean that every person who identifies as an immigrant necessarily came by choice or necessarily was reasonably prepared for their transition or had an element of choice in the destination. This immigrant here is my husband. He did come for school. He came on a student visa. He was reasonably prepared. He came here by choice because his brother had already come to the States and was at the same school. So and now he's here. Of course, he's opened a business and is contributing to the economy and our public as well. So this is kind of a typical immigrant picture, right? A migrant we can think of as one who willingly moves from one place to another or one country to another. Typically, that's in search of work or economic gain. If we're thinking now about internally displaced persons or an IDP, by definition, that's one who's forced to flee their home, but they remain within the boundaries of their home country. Now, IDPs can be displaced for war, but they can also be displaced for natural disaster or other causes. This is the largest category of forced to flee individuals. And in fact, most refugees begin as IDPs. If we separate that IDP category into folks who are impacted by other causes that are not man-made and those who are affected by man-made causes such as war, refugees must be impacted by man-made causes. They also must cross over an international boundary. So per international law, in order to qualify for refugee status, an individual is one who's forced to flee their country because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution based on race or religion or nationality or membership in a particular social group or political opinion. If an individual is considered for refugee status, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has 4 qualifying factors. First, an earnest fear of persecution. They must be living outside of the country of nationality. Again, they've crossed over those international borders. They cannot access aid from the home country, and they can't claim citizenship to another country. An asylee, similar to a refugee, is one who may have protected humanitarian status, but this person must go through, in the case of the United States, an immigration court process here to obtain this designation. Asylees begin as asylum seekers, and these individuals sometimes apply for their status at or within the borders of the country of asylum. However, once they're approved, those folks do qualify for the same kinds of services as refugees who enter through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, or who are designated initially by the UNHCR. And now let's talk for a minute about SIV, because most of us are hearing this come up in the news very frequently at this point. So an SIV is a special immigrant visa holder. And this is a special status granted to certain foreign nationals, specifically Afghanistan and Iraq, who have provided valuable service to the US government, or they've advanced the mission, the overall mission of the coalition forces in that region of conflict. These individuals are generally resettled because their lives are considered in grave danger as a result of that willingness to help in that mission of coalition forces. These individuals can be translators, journalists, women's rights activists, and others who may have been involved in helping the United States in any way. And now let's talk about humanitarian parole, which is the other piece of the puzzle that we're hearing so much as we talk about incoming Afghan evacuees in particular. And we're focusing a lot on Afghan evacuees in this particular webinar for a few reasons. First, most newcomers, as they are considered for refugee resettlement, have a long period of time, right, that they are able to start considering that adjustment. In fact, most folks live in a refugee camp, a refugee setting, without being moved for months or for years or for sometimes even decades. So there's a longer term process there. The other piece is that we don't often have folks under humanitarian parole. This is an emergency declaration, so it's used very rarely. For those of us who are in a situation of education, for example, we don't typically receive individuals who are coming in under humanitarian parole. This is a temporary status. It lasts up to 2 years. It's on a case-by-case basis, and it's used for emergent humanitarian reasons, or when we consider that that individual or family is a significant public benefit to the United States. It is not a legal immigration status. And so individuals who come in under humanitarian parole status are not eligible for the same rights or services that other refugees or asylees are able to access. And so this can create some real challenges, particularly in the world of education when we talk about access to services. However, the Biden administration recently passed legislation that updates this so that humanitarian parolees right at this moment are eligible for the same kinds of services and support available to refugees and other ORR eligible populations, meaning that they have access to all of those services. This is an important note, especially for those of us in education. When we talk about being able to refer students out, when we talk about services in schools, when we talk about additional supports, this is important information to pass on to the schools, but also to make sure that your staff and your families are well informed of. If we think for a moment about the path to refugee resettlement, we're going to take a very broad overview here. And again, we're grounding down into this idea that we're talking about a person in transit. And that, with that understanding, every experience with forced relocation is different. Each individual has access to a unique bundle of tools and challenges, right? We're talking about welcoming, discrimination they might face, financial opportunities, the level of support and care, how they feel about the host country, how the host country is receiving them, the interpersonal coping mechanisms that exist. And every individual faces different experiences with hardships, with discrimination, with racism, and with culture shock. When we think about the refugee experience, Pre-resettlement, we have an understanding that many folks will travel even through multiple countries on the way to safety. They may be leaving behind family or pets, loved ones, important documents. They may have periods of times without basic needs like water and food, and of course, for many of our students, have periods of interrupted formal education. The vast majority of refugees actually live in urban refugee camps. So many of us have this idea in our minds of kind of an organized refugee camp, such as those facilitated by the United Nations. But in fact, most refugees live in semi-organized urban camps. I've personally visited camps in this regard in Dar es Salaam, in Lebanon, and these areas operate almost as functioning towns that are self-sustaining. When we also consider children and young adults in this process, we have in mind that over half of the world's refugees are in fact children. And children are at an especially increased risk for things like exploitation, abuse, physical harm, child labor, trafficking. So we really want to keep that in mind too. If you have additional questions about that, about URMs or unaccompanied refugee minors, please reach out and I'll make sure to put you in touch with resources there. So when a refugee is designated as a refugee, the UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, has 3 durable solutions. The first is always a safe return back to the home country. That's always the goal. The second is legal permanent residence in a neighboring country. And then finally, we have this resettlement to an agreeing third-party country. And I'll pause to point out here that less than half of 1% are ever resettled to a third-party country. So those kids and families who make their way to our classrooms here, in that regard, are truly 1 in a million. The path to resettlement is really complex and robust. Refugees are the most rigorously and thoroughly vetted of all immigrant populations. The path to resettlement for refugees in particular can take months and years and even decades. And we talked about this difference too with that humanitarian parole and not speeding it up. Refugee resettlement is determined by presidential determination each fiscal year, and we've actually been on a steady decline over the years in terms of the number of refugees that we're taking in. There are a number of U.S. resettlement entities involved. Of course, we begin with the UNHCR. We process through a refugee service center. Those folks come through U.S. federal agencies for really in-depth screening and biodata, additional interviews. And then finally, they're connected with U.S. service providers where they start to receive some cultural orientation, preparation, air travel coordination, again, looking at the SIV, incoming SIVs that are being evacuated rapidly, and also our humanitarian parolees, that skipping the step, right, of cultural orientation and preparation is something that we'll need to be aware of as folks may be coming in. We're not going to get too heavy into numbers here, but I would like to point out that if you're curious about what that looks like in your state, here's a resource for that. You can check out Refugee Council USA and get a breakdown of where incoming refugees, humanitarian parolees may be relocating to in the United States. And then finally, we're going to take a look at the experiences of recent arrivals. Now, we mentioned that final step is service agencies, and those service agencies have some responsibilities. They have some obligations to our incoming families. They do things like helping with school enrollment, of coordinating that first health screening, of adult ESL and job training, and greeting incoming families, making sure that initial housing is secured. They may help with initial clothing, especially for colder places. If you are looking for service agencies in your area, this is an interactive map that I highly recommend, especially in looking at referring folks out for additional services. And new American neighbors also have certain obligations. Of course, they need to abide by US, state, and local laws. They must participate in English as a new language course or classes. They're obligated to search for employment or obtain employment or attend school. And finally, they are expected to repay over time that initial travel loan. Now let's talk a little bit about how we can support folks coming in. But before we get there, we're going to take a look at transition shock. And we can think of transition shock as this kind of broader overarching umbrella that encompasses trauma, but it also encompasses persistent stress and anxiety. It encompasses on the far end post-traumatic stress. It also captures culture shock. And for those of us working with diverse populations, we can't really think about trauma without encompassing that culture shock piece. If we go back for a moment to that broader umbrella of transition shock, which included trauma, but it also includes that culture shock, right? We can further divide culture shock into these phases that are well observed. And that first is kind of a honeymoon period. It's a romanticized time. We enter a negotiation period where we start to have some internal struggles. We may start to compare our two destinations. We might have some frustration or anxiety. Many folks move into a period of adjustment. This is where we get into sense making, maneuverability. We can lean into isolation or adoption, but the best place for our individuals to be is this area of integration, this kind of sweet spot in the middle of adjustment. And then eventually, over time, we enter a phase of mastery, where we're able to negotiate both of our cultures with a sense of ease and fluidity. Here's that sweet spot in the middle, right? Isolation on one side, where we can encounter disengagement with the new culture. We can lean into adoption, where we fully adopt the new culture at the expense of the old one, or we can find ourselves in the middle, this integration. And that's where we find the most success and being able to maintain both cultures, maintain a strong sense of identity, feelings of social acceptance and well-being and cooperative relationships. We're also going to talk about risk factors. So risk factors make individuals more susceptible to transition shock. They're not direct causes of trauma or transition shock, but they can contribute to it. Broadly speaking, the more risk factors a person has, the higher the probability that they will experience what we call power disruptions, or that they will experience transition shock, which could include trauma. We can also think of these risk factors in pre-transition, post-transition, or access to care categories, and we can be mindful that these can all overlap. An individual may have some or many or none of these, right? So conditional risk factors, we think of things like family stability, poverty, malnutrition, perinatal and infant complications. Pre-risk factors for refugees and asylees in particular, we're looking at things like war or violence or persecution or flight or loss of loved ones or pets, exposure to trauma, family discohesion. Once they've transitioned to the new country, we think about culture shock, of course. We examine the views of stress and coping, or attitudes about the country of origination versus the destination. Mental and physical health disabilities, ability to maneuver linguistically. We have access to care risk factors like access to equitable education, to heritage culture communities, to support groups, to high-paying work opportunities, to areas that are free of discrimination and racism, and equitable healthcare. In order to help folks move into this area of integration and to diminish risk factors, we can boost protect factors. So protect factors are all those things that counter risk factors. They have sort of insulating properties. They support healthy coping mechanisms, bolster resilience. They cultivate trust and safety, and a reminder that they don't exclude a person from hardship, but they can help to buffer the effects of it. And here are some of those protect factors that you might be on the lookout for if you're analyzing your own environment at school or in your organization, to see what mechanisms you already have in place. And if you don't have these in place, what you can do to help bolster those so that we can expand our protect factors, diminish our risk factors, and can help folks move into this area of integration. And finally, just before we turn it over to Nazar, I want to leave us on this note, of course, that there are numerous benefits to welcoming recent arrivals into our communities. Newcomers have inherent worth as dignity and humans, and frankly, it's just simply the right thing to do to welcome folks in and open our arms and be receptive. Resettling those who have assisted in the government, like our SIVs, aids democracy efforts worldwide. We also know that newcomers have a tremendously positive net impact on the economy, that they contribute to the nation's fiscal well-being via earning power, via spending power, and also through taxation. And finally, newcomers, of course, add tremendous value to our communities by sharing their talents, their wisdom, their skills, their culture, their food, their language, their ideas and experiences. So these folks are a benefit to our communities. We're so thrilled that you're here because you showing up speaks to your commitment also to welcoming. Before we head out, here are some of my favorite resources. I'd invite you to check those out if you'd like a deeper understanding of the refugee process. Colorado Refugee Connect is a great place to do that. But we hope you enjoy some of these resources.